At 9:42 a.m. on July 14, 1944, the sky over Budapest was alive with black explosions. Thick bursts of flak bloomed like poisonous flowers around a formation of American B-17 flying fortresses pushing deeper into enemy territory. Inside one of those bombers sat First Lieutenant Ewald Swanson, just 24 years old, hands steady on the controls, eyes fixed forward. He had flown 17 combat missions already. Each one had carried the same unspoken truth: survival was never guaranteed. The aircraft he commanded, a B-17G, nicknamed Mispa, vibrated under the strain of altitude, cold, and enemy fire as it held formation with nearly 60 other bombers from the 483rd Bomb Group, flying out of Sterperone, Italy. The mission brief that morning had been simple: strike the Shell oil refinery and the railway yards feeding German supply lines in Budapest, cripple the logistics supporting the Eastern Front, then turn southwest and make it home. On paper, it was just another bombing run. In reality, every man aboard knew the statistics. By mid-1944, crews in the 15th Air Force understood the odds better than anyone. Out of every 10 airmen who climbed into a bomber, only 2 could expect to finish a full tour. The rest would die, be captured, or vanish into wreckage scattered across Europe. No one said it aloud, but every crew felt it as they climbed toward 30,000 feet. Flak began hitting Mispa almost immediately. Sharp metallic impacts echoed through the fuselage as shrapnel tore holes through aluminum skin. The tail took a hit, then the wings. Warning lights flickered. The aircraft shuddered but stayed in formation. Behind Swanson, the crew remained at their stations. Co-pilot, Second Lieutenant Paul Berndt, sat rigidly beside him. In the nose, Bombardier Second Lieutenant Kenneth Dudley prepared for the drop, eyes on the Norden bomb site. Navigator Second Lieutenant Joe Henderson calculated headings and timing. 8 other men were spread throughout the aircraft, gunners watching the sky, the flight engineer monitoring engines, the radio operator listening to static and fragmented calls. As the formation approached the target, the flak intensified. Hungarian and German gunners had ringed the railway yards with heavy 88mm guns, hundreds of them, firing in coordinated barrages. The sky ahead was thick with exploding shells. Swanson held course. Breaking formation meant becoming a lone target, and lone bombers rarely survived. Seconds from the release point, Dudley called out his final corrections. Then he released the bomb load. 2 tons of explosives dropped away, and Mispa leapt upward as the weight vanished. The next moment erased everything. An 88mm shell detonated directly into the nose of the aircraft. The explosion was instantaneous and absolute. The entire front section of Mispa disappeared in a flash of fire and metal. The bombardier's compartment, the navigator's station, the Norden bomb site, the plexiglass nose, all of it was simply gone. Kenneth Dudley died instantly. Joe Henderson died instantly. There was no time for pain, no awareness, just violent obliteration. The blast wave ripped backward through the aircraft, tearing wiring, ripping panels loose, spraying blood and debris across what remained of the cockpit. Swanson felt the aircraft violently pitch upward. With the entire nose section gone, the center of gravity shifted rearward, forcing the bomber into a near vertical climb. The B-17 began to stall. Cold air at 40 degrees below zero screamed into the open cavity where the nose had been, slamming into Swanson's face and chest. Blood covered the cockpit floor. Wind tore at his flight suit. Where instruments should have been, there was nothing but sky. The control column was gone. The instrument panel was gone. Everything forward of the cockpit bulkhead had ceased to exist. Swanson had no airspeed indicator, no altimeter, no artificial horizon, no compass. The aircraft was still moving, still alive, but he had no idea how fast, how high, or how close it was to losing control completely. All he had was instinct
experience, and the horizon visible through the massive hole where the nose used to be. Somehow, the control cables remained intact. The steel cables that ran from the cockpit through the fuselage to the rudder, elevators, and ailerons were now exposed, whipping in the 300-mile-per-hour wind. They should have snapped. They didn't. Swanson forced the nose down, not knowing exactly how, feeling resistance where controls should not have existed. The bomber leveled out, barely, wobbling like a wounded animal. Against all logic, Mispa remained airborne.
The formation continued ahead, pulling away, unaware of what had just happened behind them. Swanson could see other B-17s through the open void, dark shapes moving steadily toward the rally point. His aircraft was no longer truly flyable, but physics and the inherent stability of the B-17 were buying him time. Boeing engineers had designed the Flying Fortress to absorb damage, but no one had imagined this. Inside the aircraft, shock gave way to action. Crew members began moving forward, drawn by the noise and the cold. They saw the exposed control cables running through the bomb bay, flailing violently. They saw the empty space where the nose had been. They understood instantly that something was terribly wrong. There was no intercom, no way to communicate clearly with the cockpit. Everything would have to be done by instinct and cooperation. At 9:44 a.m., before anyone could fully grasp the situation, another 88mm shell struck engine number 2. The right inboard engine erupted in flame and debris, oil streaking back across the wing as the propeller seized and froze. Inside the shattered fuselage, the vibration changed instantly. Swanson felt it through the throttles, a subtle but unmistakable loss of power and symmetry. 3 engines were now dragging a bomber that no longer had a nose, no instruments, no real cockpit, and almost no aerodynamic balance. The B-17 shuddered as drag increased and airspeed bled away. Outside, the formation continued forward, rigid and unforgiving, because bomber doctrine allowed no mercy for crippled aircraft. To slow down was to die. Within minutes, Mispa was slipping behind, the black silhouettes of the other fortresses stretching farther ahead with every passing second. Inside the bomb bay, the exposed control cables whipped violently in the 300-mile-per-hour slipstream, humming like giant steel guitar strings. Frank Gemenzi, George Simonelli, and Robert Bell braced themselves against the airframe, wrapping their gloved hands around the freezing cables. Every movement hurt. The steel bit through leather and numbed fingers instantly, but when they pulled, the aircraft responded. Not smoothly, not cleanly, but just enough. A pull on the elevator cable nudged the nose down. A yank on the rudder cable corrected a drift. They could not see the horizon. They could not see Swanson. They worked entirely by instinct, by vibration, by the way the bomber seemed to lean and strain like a wounded animal fighting to stay upright. Coordination came through shouted guesses and timing rather than words. Swanson adjusted power on engine 1, felt the yaw begin, and seconds later the cable tension changed as the crew compensated. It was crude, exhausting, and terrifyingly imprecise, but it worked. For minute after minute, Mispa remained in the air when it had no right to be. By 9:46 a.m., the flak bursts faded behind them, replaced by an uneasy silence broken only by the wind screaming through the open nose cavity and the uneven thunder of 3 Cyclone engines. They were alone now, fully separated from the formation, a solitary target drifting southwest over occupied territory. Fighters could appear at any moment. Swanson scanned the sky through the gaping hole where his instruments once lived, his eyes watering from the cold and the force of the airflow. The temperature at altitude cut through every layer of clothing, turning sweat to ice almost instantly. Behind him, the crew pulling cables began to feel the deeper problem, structural failure. The fuselage flexed in ways that aircraft were never meant to flex. Metal groaned, rivets popped. The tail section, already weakened by shock waves and shrapnel, began to oscillate, a subtle but deadly motion that meant the rear of the aircraft was slowly tearing itself apart. Charles Tucker, isolated in the tail gunner position, felt it first. The vibration was wrong, irregular, like the aircraft was breathing too hard.
He crawled forward to warn the others, his movements clumsy in the chaos of wind and exposed structure. When the crew saw the movement ripple through the fuselage skin, they understood immediately. The tail would not hold forever. When it failed, there would be no warning and no survival. The realization changed everything. Up to that point, the fight had been about staying airborne. Now it became about buying time. Time for separation, time for escape, time for survival. Without instruments, without navigation, and without reliable control, landing was impossible. Their only option was to abandon the aircraft while it was still in one piece. No order came from the cockpit because no communication system remained. The decision happened silently and collectively, driven by the same understanding that had brought their hands to the cables. One by one, the men began to let go. Each release made the aircraft harder to control, more unstable, more unpredictable. Bell jumped first, then Kelly, then Simonelli, their parachutes snapping open far below as Mispa lurched and wallowed in protest. Each departure felt like tearing away another piece of stability, but there was no alternative. Staying was certain death. By the time Tucker reached the waist gun opening and disappeared into the slipstream, only a handful remained aboard, and the bomber's movements had grown sluggish and erratic, like a drunk staggering downhill.
As the last of the enlisted crew evacuated, Swanson remained locked in the pilot's seat, his hands clenched around the throttles, his feet planted uselessly on rudder pedals that no longer controlled anything. The aircraft was descending steadily now, altitude bleeding away in silence measured only by the changing texture of the clouds and the growing clarity of the land below. Paul Berndt, the co-pilot, understood what had to happen without a word. There was no heroism left in staying. He unbuckled, gave Swanson one final look, and made his way aft to jump, leaving the pilot completely alone in the remains of the fortress. The bomber continued on, 3 engines still running, dragging the broken airframe forward on sheer momentum and stubborn physics. Swanson stayed with it longer than any reasonable man would have. He stayed to widen the distance between the crash site and his crew, to give them a better chance on the ground, to make their survival mean something. When he finally released the throttles and stood, the aircraft immediately betrayed him, rolling and pitching as if relieved of its burden. He fought his way aft through vibrating aluminum and shrieking wind, clipped on his parachute, and jumped as the B-17 tipped into a steeper descent. The slipstream flung him clear, the aircraft roaring past like a living thing finally allowed to die. Seconds later, his chute blossomed, the violent jerk stealing his breath as silence replaced the engine noise. Below him, Mispa broke apart, the tail tearing free before the rest of the bomber plunged into the Yugoslav forest and vanished in fire. Swanson descended slowly, helplessly, watching the end of the aircraft that had kept him alive long enough to escape. When he hit the trees, pain exploded through his leg, the fracture immediate and undeniable. Hanging, injured and bleeding, he was captured within minutes, his war ending not in triumph, but in survival. He would later learn that every man who jumped lived, that all 8 survivors endured captivity and returned home. The bomber was gone. 2 men were dead. But against all logic and engineering limits, a crew had flown 10 minutes without a nose, without instruments, and without control columns, held aloft by exposed steel cables and an absolute refusal to give up. By the time the last parachute disappeared into the sky, the B-17 was no longer a bomber in any meaningful sense. It was a wounded structure barely held together by airflow, momentum, and habit. 3 engines still ran, but they were fighting drag, imbalance, and damage that no checklist had ever imagined. Ewald Swanson sat alone in what remained of the cockpit, gripping the throttles not because they offered control, but because they were the only solid connection he had left to the machine. The wind screamed through the open nose with such force that breathing required effort. Every vibration felt amplified, every shudder a warning that the aircraft was nearing the end of what physics would allow.
The control cables hung useless behind him now, no hands left to pull them, no human correction between intention and disaster. The bomber descended steadily, not violently, not dramatically, just slipping downward minute by minute, like a man bleeding out quietly rather than dying in a single blow. Swanson had known from the moment the crew began jumping that this ending was inevitable. The aircraft could not be saved. It was never about landing it, never about bringing it home. From the moment the nose was torn away over Budapest, the mission had changed into something far simpler and far more brutal. Buy time. Time for the others to live. Time for distance between parachutes and wreckage. Time to turn a certain collective death into individual chances at survival. That was why he stayed. That was why he kept flying a bomber that no longer truly flew. Each additional minute in the air stretched the map, widened the circle of uncertainty for German patrols, and increased the odds that the men below might land somewhere slightly less exposed, slightly less obvious. It was not heroism in the cinematic sense. It was calculation, responsibility, and refusal to abandon the role he had accepted when he took the left seat. At around 10 a.m., with the altitude bleeding away and the vibrations growing harsher, Swanson made his final decision. 2 more minutes would risk everything. 30 seconds too late, and he would be trapped by forces no human could fight. He released the throttles, unbuckled, and immediately felt the aircraft respond, not with obedience, but with indifference. The bomber began to roll gently, then nose down, no longer restrained by constant correction. Moving inside the aircraft felt like walking inside a collapsing building. The floor tilted beneath his boots. Wind clawed at his body, trying to pull him forward through the opening where the nose had once been. He fought his way toward the waist section, every step accompanied by the knowledge that the aircraft was accelerating, that gravity was beginning to win. When he reached the exit, there was no pause, no hesitation, no prayer. He jumped. The slipstream seized him instantly, violent and disorienting, spinning him away from the falling bomber. For a brief moment he saw the B-17 plunge past him, engines still roaring, a machine continuing its last act long after its crew had left it behind. He pulled the ripcord, and the parachute opened with a force that tore the air from his lungs and snapped his body upright. The noise vanished. The violence softened into a vast, eerie quiet, broken only by wind and distant echoes. Above him, the bomber continued its descent, and moments later, its tail finally failed. The aircraft folded, twisted, and vanished into the trees below in a burst of smoke and fire. There were no survivors left inside. There could not have been. The descent felt longer than it was. Pain arrived when the branches did. Swanson struck the trees hard, snapping limbs, tumbling, and finally slamming into a thick branch that shattered his left leg with a sound he would remember for the rest of his life. He hung suspended in the parachute harness, bleeding, disoriented, and unable to move. Below him, the war continued without pause. German voices rose from the forest floor. Soldiers arrived quickly, methodical, and unsurprised. They had seen parachutes before. They had collected airmen before. Swanson did not resist. There was nowhere to go, and no strength left to fight. A medic stabilized his leg, administered morphine, and prepared him for transport. The pain dulled, replaced by exhaustion so deep it felt like sinking underwater. Capture brought survival, not comfort. Over the following days, the rest of the crew was rounded up. Every man who had jumped survived. None escaped. Yugoslavia was too heavily patrolled, too exposed. One by one, they were reunited in captivity, thinner, dirtier, shaken, but alive. They were moved through processing centers and eventually into a prisoner of war camp where time slowed to a crawl. Food was scarce, routines monotonous, hope rationed. Swanson's leg healed slowly, under minimal care. The cast came off months later. He learned to walk again inside barbed wire fences, measuring recovery and laps around muddy compounds. The war outside continued, distant yet ever present, marked by rumors, distant artillery, and the shifting behavior of guards as Germany's position weakened. What never faded was the memory of those 10 minutes, the cold, the wind, the sight of the sky where instruments should be, the feeling of an aircraft responding not to controls, but to teamwork and desperation. The men spoke of it often in quiet moments, replaying details, filling gaps, understanding fully only afterwards how close they had come to disappearing entirely. Dudley and Henderson were spoken of too, always by name, always as part of the crew. The bomber had lost its nose, but the crew had not lost its center.
When liberation finally came in 1945, it felt unreal. American tanks, familiar uniforms, voices that sounded like home. The war ended not with celebration, but with release. Swanson returned to the United States with a limp that faded over time and memories that never did. He built a life that did not revolve around that mission, but it was never separate from it either. He rarely spoke about what happened, not because it was secret, but because some experiences resist simplification. Flying without a cockpit was not bravery in isolation. It was duty, shared responsibility, and trust stretched to its absolute limit. Years later, technology would advance, aircraft would become stronger, safer, smarter, but no system ever replaced the human element that kept MISPA airborne after physics had voted against it. 10 minutes held together by bare cables, frozen hands, and men who understood that survival sometimes depends not on saving the machine, but on knowing when to let it go. And because of that understanding, 8 men lived to tell a story that should never have existed at all. By the time the parachute finally settled and Evald Swanson's boots touched the Yugoslav soil, the war had already taken everything it was ever going to take from him. His aircraft was gone. His mission was over. 2 of his crewmen were dead. The rest were scattered across the countryside, descending into captivity one by one. And yet, despite the pain in his shattered leg and the knowledge that German soldiers were only minutes away, Swanson was alive. That fact alone felt unreal. As he lay tangled in parachute silk beneath the trees, listening to distant voices growing closer, he understood something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Survival was not a moment, it was a process. It did not end when the aircraft hit the ground or when the parachute opened. Survival continued in captivity, in pain, in memory, and in the long years that followed. When the German soldiers finally reached him, weapons raised, faces cautious, Swanson did not resist. He had no strength left for defiance. He was lifted, treated, transported, processed, cataloged like thousands of other airmen before him. His name, rank, and serial number became his entire identity. The war, for him, had narrowed to a hospital bed, a plaster cast, and the slow realization that everything he had trained for was finished. Captivity stripped life down to its bare essentials. Days blended together inside barbed wire fences where time was measured not by clocks, but by meals, roll calls, and rumors. Swanson's leg healed slowly, the bone knitting itself back together while his mind replayed the mission again and again. He thought about the moment the nose disappeared, about the cold, about the sound of wind screaming through empty space, about the feeling of being absolutely responsible for the lives of others when physics itself had turned hostile. Around him, other prisoners told similar stories, each one different, each one carrying the same undercurrent of loss. Airmen talked about crews who never came back, aircraft that vanished into clouds or oceans, men who were alive one second and gone the next. At night, when the barracks went quiet, Swanson sometimes closed his eyes and saw the exposed control cables whipping in the wind, felt the pressure of hands pulling steel to keep a dying bomber alive. He never spoke much during those moments. He listened, remembered, endured. When liberation finally came, it did not arrive with triumph. It arrived with exhaustion. The men were thin, older than their years, changed in ways that photographs could never capture. Freedom felt strange at first, almost uncomfortable. There were no throttles to manage, no cables to pull, no immediate danger demanding focus, just open space and the knowledge that life would have to be rebuilt from fragments. Swanson returned home, married, worked, raised children, and lived quietly. He rarely told the story in full, not because he forgot it, but because he remembered it too clearly. Some experiences are not meant to be relived aloud. They are meant to be carried. When he did speak, it was never about heroism. It was about the crew, about how survival had nothing to do with bravery and everything to do with refusing to let go when letting go would have been easier. He believed the real miracle was not that the aircraft stayed in the air for 10 minutes without a nose, but that ordinary men, placed in an impossible situation, chose cooperation over panic, action over surrender. Long after the war ended, after the aircraft rusted away in museums and the battlefields grew quiet, the story of that B-17 remained a testament to something timeless. Not to machines or tactics or even victory, but to human resilience under pressure. A bomber is just metal and rivets. What kept that aircraft flying was not design, but people. Hands on cables, eyes on the horizon, a shared understanding that quitting meant death and persistence meant a chance. Ewald Swanson lived to old age, but the most important minutes of his life were those 10 minutes over Budapest, when everything that could fail did fail, and the only thing left was will. That is why the story matters, not because it is dramatic, but because it is true, because it reminds us that even when systems collapse, even when structure disappears, human determination can still hold something together long enough for others to survive. And sometimes that's more than enough.